The nuns told me I was born in darkness. For years I believed my earliest memory was a dream. The cold stone walls of our prison below the church were the only home my family ever knew after that Christmas night. I was only 4 years old when my family attended the midnight Christmas Mass at St. Augustine Chapel in the winter of 2003. My memories of life before the tunnels are fragmented like shattered stained glass. We lived in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield, a small rural community where everyone knew everyone and the church stood as the center of all activity. My father worked as the town veterinarian, while my mother taught music at the local elementary school. I had 2 older siblings. My brother Thomas was 11 and my sister Sarah was 9. We were the picture-perfect family in our small community. Our farmhouse sat on 5 acres of land. The walls were painted a warm yellow that seemed to glow in the summer sunlight. I can still recall the creaking of the wooden porch swing where my mother would read to us on Sunday afternoons, the smell of fresh baked bread that wafted through the kitchen window, the sound of my father's boots on the hardwood floors when he returned from a long day of work. These fragments of memory are all I have left of my life before. St. Augustine Chapel had stood in Millfield for over 200 years. The stone structure was built by colonial settlers and had weathered countless storms. Father Michael had been the parish priest for nearly 30 years when we attended that fateful Christmas Mass. The elderly sacristan, Mr. Peterson, had served the church even longer. The chapel was known for its beautiful architecture and the mysterious network of tunnels beneath it that were said to have been used during wartime. My parents were devoted Catholics. Every Sunday without fail, we would dress in our best clothes and attend morning service. My father was a respected member of the parish council. My mother played the organ during special services. The church was as much a part of our identity as our own name. We trusted Father Michael completely. He had baptized all 3 of us children and was a regular guest at our dinner table. The winter of 2003 was particularly harsh in our region. Snow had fallen heavily for days leading up to Christmas. The roads were treacherous, but my parents were determined that we would attend midnight mass, as was our tradition. I remember my mother bundling me in layers of clothes, my red wool coat with the velvet collar, the matching hat and mittens that my grandmother had knitted, my shiny black patent leather shoes that clicked on the hardwood floors. The night was clear and cold. Stars glittered like diamonds in the black sky as we drove the 15 minutes to St. Augustine. The chapel looked magical that night. Candles flickered in every window. The stained glass depicting the nativity scene glowed from within. Fresh pine garlands and red ribbons adorned the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the sweet scent of beeswax candles. We sat in our usual pew, 3rd from the front on the right side. I remember the way the candlelight played across the faces of the congregation, the solemn expressions as Father Michael delivered his sermon about the chosen ones who would inherit the kingdom of heaven, how his eyes seemed to linger on our family more than others. At the time, it seemed like an honor. Later, I would understand it was the beginning of our nightmare. After the service, most of the congregation hurried home to warm houses and waiting presents. The snow had started again, large flakes drifting lazily from the sky. Father Michael approached my parents and asked if they would stay behind. He had something special to show us, something he claimed was a sign from God meant specifically for our family. My parents, flattered by his attention, agreed without hesitation. Mr. Peterson, the old sacristan, led us to a small door behind the altar. It creaked open to reveal a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Father Michael went first, holding an ornate brass lantern that cast long shadows on the walls. My father followed, carrying me in his arms because I was too tired to walk. My mother held the hands of Thomas and Sarah as we made our way down the winding steps. The air grew colder and damper with each step. I remember pressing my face against my father's shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of his aftershave, mixed with wool from his coat. The comfort of his arms would be the last safety I would know for many years. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper beneath the church than seemed possible. Finally, we reached the bottom and stood in a small antechamber with 3 tunnel entrances. Father Michael turned to us, his face transformed in the flickering light of the lantern. His eyes shone with a fervor I had never seen before. He told my parents that our family had been chosen by God for a special purpose, that we would be the first inhabitants of the new holy sanctuary he had prepared, a place where we would be protected from the sins of the world until the time of rapture came. My parents' expressions changed from curiosity to concern. My father told Father Michael that we needed to get home. The children were tired and it was late. That was when Mr. Peterson emerged from the shadows behind us. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs closed with a thud that echoed through the stone chamber. Father Michael explained that we could not leave, that God had spoken to him and commanded that the chosen ones must remain in sanctuary. My father moved to push past him, still holding me tightly in his arms. Mr. Peterson struck him from behind with something heavy. My mother screamed as my father crumpled to the ground. I tumbled from his arms onto the cold stone floor. What followed was chaos and terror. My mother fought desperately to protect us. Sarah and Thomas tried to run back up the stairs, but found the door locked from the outside. Mr. Peterson and Father Michael were stronger. They subdued my mother with rope they had prepared. My father regained consciousness only to be restrained as well. We were each separated and led down different tunnels. The last sight I had of my family whole was my mother, straining against her bonds, tears streaming down her face as she called out our names. I was taken to a small chamber with a metal bed, a bucket for waste, and a small table. The stone walls were damp and cold. A single lantern provided the only light. Father Michael told me this was my new home, that I was blessed among children to be chosen for this holy purpose, that I must pray and prepare for the day when God would call us to heaven. The heavy wooden door closed behind him, and I heard the scrape of a lock sliding into place. I was alone in the darkness, completely alone, just 4 years old and unable to understand what had happened or why. I cried for my mother until my throat was raw. I called for my father until my voice gave out. Sleep finally came as exhaustion overtook terror. This was the beginning of my imprisonment beneath St. Augustine Chapel, the beginning of the darkness that would shape my life and eventually fuel my need for vengeance. The days following our imprisonment blended together in an endless cycle of fear and confusion. Father Michael visited each of our chambers regularly. He brought simple meals of bread, cheese, and water, sometimes fruit when we had been particularly obedient in our prayers. He read scripture to us for hours, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he expounded on his twisted interpretation of divine will. We were the chosen family, he said, pure vessels kept safe from the corruption of modern society. Our imprisonment was not punishment, but protection. Mr. Peterson rarely spoke during his visits. He was responsible for emptying our waste buckets and providing fresh water for washing. His eyes never met ours, as if by avoiding our gaze he could deny our humanity. Later I would learn that his loyalty to Father Michael was born from a lifetime of subservience and fear, rather than shared madness. Still, he was complicit in every moment of our suffering. During the first weeks, I could hear my family members calling out to each other through the thick walls. My mother's voice was strongest, singing lullabies at night that echoed through the tunnels to comfort us. My father would call out roll call each morning, making sure we were all still alive. Thomas and Sarah would tell jokes or stories to keep our spirits up. We created a system of communication by tapping on the pipes that ran through our chambers. 3 taps meant I love you. 2 meant have courage. One was a warning that Father Michael or Mr. Peterson was coming. As weeks turned to months, the voices grew weaker, the tapping less frequent. Father Michael had discovered our communication system and punished any attempt to speak to each other with days of darkness. No lantern, no food, only water and scripture read in the pitch black by his disembodied voice. These punishments were most severe for my parents, who he claimed were contaminating the purity of our isolation with their attempts to maintain family bonds. After 6 months, we were allowed to see each other once a week during what Father Michael called Holy Communion. We would be led to a larger chamber where a crude altar had been constructed from stone and wood. We were forbidden from touching or speaking to each other. We could only kneel side by side and pray as Father Michael performed his version of Mass. These glimpses of my family were both comfort and torture. I could see the weight loss in their frames, the pallor of their skin from lack of sunlight, the desperation in their eyes. My father tried to escape during one of these services. He had somehow loosened a piece of stone from his chamber wall and concealed it in his clothing. As Father Michael turned to the altar, my father struck him from behind. In the chaos that followed, he shouted for us to run, but there was nowhere to run to. All the tunnel exits were locked. Mr. Peterson subdued my father with brutal efficiency, while Father Michael watched, blood streaming from a wound on his temple. That was the last time we saw my father at Holy Communion. A month passed before. My mother asked about him during one of our services. Father Michael informed us that my father had been separated from us for purification. His soul had been corrupted by thoughts of the outside world, and he required special attention to cleanse him of these sins. I remember the look that passed between my mother and Thomas, a silent acknowledgement that something terrible had happened. Sarah began to cry and was immediately removed from the service. Her punishment was 2 weeks without Holy Communion. The second year of our imprisonment brought new horrors. Father Michael became convinced that our physical comfort was an impediment to spiritual growth. Our mattresses were removed, replaced with thin pallets on the stone floor. Our meals became more sparse. The tunnels grew colder as winter set in. Above ground, but we were given no additional blankets. My mother became ill with what I now know was pneumonia. Her coughing echoed through the tunnels at night. During this time, Thomas took on the role of protector. He was 13 now and growing despite the meager rations. During Holy Communion, he would position himself between Father Michael and Sarah and me. He found ways to sneak extra food to us, going hungry himself so that we might have more. He whispered encouragement when Father Michael wasn't looking. He promised that he was working on a plan to get us out. One night, I was awakened by unusual sounds echoing through the tunnels, shouts and what sounded like a struggle. Then silence, more complete than any I had experienced before. The next morning, Mr. Peterson came alone to my chamber. His face was ashen, and his hands trembled as he set down my breakfast tray. I asked him where Father Michael was. He told me that Father Michael was praying for the soul of my brother who had attempted to escape through the tunnels and lost his way in the darkness. I knew then that Thomas was gone, though whether dead or truly escaped I did not know. Father Michael returned 3 days later. His robes were clean, but there was dirt beneath his fingernails. He spoke of Thomas as a cautionary tale, how the impure of heart would find only death in their attempts to flee God's sanctuary. During the next Holy Communion, my mother had to be carried in. Her illness had progressed to the point where she could no longer walk unassisted. Sarah was thinner than ever, her once bright eyes now dull and vacant. We knelt together, the remnants of our family, as Father Michael ranted about sacrifice and divine purpose. That night, Sarah came to my chamber. Somehow, she had discovered a connection between our rooms, a small opening in the stone wall where the mortar had crumbled away. She was 11 now, still small enough to squeeze through spaces that adults could not navigate. She told me that our mother was dying, that Thomas had not escaped, but had been killed by Father Michael when he discovered Thomas had been secretly collecting small tools with which to pick the locks. She told me we needed to be ready to run if an opportunity presented itself. Sarah visited me several more times over the following weeks, each time bringing news more dire than the last. Our mother refused to eat. Father Michael had taken to reading scripture to her constantly, believing her refusal was a form of spiritual rebellion rather than the body shutting down. Mr. Peterson had begun to question Father Michael's methods, leading to arguments we could hear echoing through the tunnels. The fragile hierarchy of our prison was beginning to fracture. The night our mother died, I knew before anyone told me. A silence fell over the tunnels that was different from any before. No coughing, no whispered prayers, nothing but the drip of water from the stone ceiling. Father Michael came to my chamber at what I assumed was dawn, though we had no way to track time. He told me my mother had ascended to heaven, that she had finally achieved the purity of spirit necessary to join the angels. His eyes were wild, his speech more disjointed than usual. I realized then that his madness was deepening. The next Holy Communion was attended only by Sarah and me. We knelt before the altar as Father Michael performed his rituals. Sarah reached for my hand when his back was turned. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was strong. She whispered that she had found something, a key that Mr. Peterson had dropped during one of his increasingly careless visits. She had managed to create an impression of it in a piece of soap, and was working on crafting a copy from a metal food tray. Hope, long dormant, flickered to life inside me. Before Sarah could complete her key, Mr. Peterson failed to appear for 3 consecutive days. Our chambers remained locked. No food was delivered, no water refreshed. Sarah could no longer visit me through our secret passage, as she had grown too weak from hunger. I could hear Father Michael pacing the tunnels, his footsteps erratic, his voice raised in argument, though no one responded. He was speaking to God, to himself, to the ghosts of my family members. His madness had consumed him entirely. When he finally came to my chamber, Father Michael was transformed. His clerical collar was askew, his hair wild and unwashed. He told me that Mr. Peterson had abandoned his post, had abandoned God's work, that now it was only Father Michael who stood between the chosen ones and the corruption of the outside world. He seemed not to notice or care that Sarah and I were slowly starving, that we were the only chosen ones left. The betrayal that had begun with trust in a respected religious figure had culminated in the death of my entire family. Father Michael, once the shepherd of our community, had become the wolf that devoured us one by one. The elderly sacristan, trusted by generations of parishioners, had enabled years of torture through his silence and compliance. The church, meant to be a sanctuary of peace and love, had become our tomb. Every value my parents had taught me about, faith and trust, had been perverted by the very institution that espoused them. On what I would later learn was the 5th anniversary of our imprisonment, Father Michael came to my chamber in a state of complete delirium. He spoke of angels descending through the stone ceiling, of heavenly light filling the tunnels, of my family waiting in paradise for the final chosen ones to join them. He had not brought food or water in days. I was 9 years old, severely malnourished and aware that I was dying, that Sarah, if she still lived, was dying too, that Father Michael's madness would be the last thing I experienced in this world. I did not know then that above us changes were taking place that would alter the course of my life, that the elderly sacristan, facing his own mortality, had finally found the courage to speak, that a new order of nuns had taken over administration of St. Augustine Chapel after Father Michael's mysterious disappearance had prompted an investigation by the diocese. That soon light would enter our darkness for the first time in 5 years. The betrayal was complete, but the story of the chosen ones was far from over. The day of our rescue remains vivid in my memory, despite the haze of malnutrition and dehydration that clouded my senses, the sound of unfamiliar voices echoing through the tunnels, the scrape of the lock as my chamber door opened for the first time in years. The shock on the faces of the nuns as they discovered a living child in the darkness beneath their church. I remember being afraid of the light, of covering my eyes and shrinking back into the corner of my stone prison as they approached. They spoke softly, these women in black and white habits. One knelt before me, her face lined with age and compassion. She told me her name was Sister Agnes, that I was safe now, that no one would hurt me anymore. I asked about Sarah, about Father Michael, about Mr. Peterson. Their exchanged glances told me everything before their words confirmed it. Sarah had been found in her chamber, already gone from this world. Father Michael had fled when Mr. Peterson finally confessed to the new parish priest. The authorities were searching for him. I was carried up the winding stone staircase I had descended 5 years earlier, each step taking me closer to a world I barely remembered. The brightness of the chapel made me weep, not from joy but from pain as my eyes, accustomed to darkness, struggled to adjust. The smell of incense, once associated with comfort and family, now triggered waves of nausea and terror. The sound of the church organ practicing for Sunday service sent me into a panic so severe that I lost consciousness. I awoke in a hospital room. The whiteness of the walls, the antiseptic smell, the soft beeping of machines, all of it foreign and frightening. A doctor explained my condition in hushed tones to Sister Agnes, who had remained by my side. Severe malnourishment, vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, developmental delays, post-traumatic stress disorder. A list of medical terms that would shape my recovery for years to come. The police came to interview me, gentle officers with soft voices and sad eyes who asked questions about Father Michael, about our imprisonment, about what had happened to my family. I told them everything I could remember, my voice rusty from disuse. They recorded my statement, thanked me, and promised that Father Michael would face justice for his crimes. It was a promise they were unable to keep. The news of our discovery spread through the community like wildfire. The family that had disappeared. After Christmas Mass, the mad priest who believed they were chosen by God, the elderly Sacristan whose deathbed confession had led to the rescue of the sole surviving child. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for interviews and photographs. Sister Agnes and the hospital staff formed a protective barrier around me, shielding me from the media frenzy. The question of what would happen to me now loomed large. I had no remaining family in the area. My parents had both been only children whose parents had passed away years before. The state prepared to place me in foster care once I was physically recovered. The thought of being with strangers, of leaving the nuns who had rescued me, triggered another round of panic attacks. Sister Agnes proposed an alternative. The convent attached to St. Augustine Chapel would take me in, would provide me with education, therapy, and a stable home while I recovered from my ordeal. The irony of being raised in the shadow of the place where my family had died was not lost on anyone. But Sister Agnes argued that removing me from the only community I had known, however traumatic that knowledge was, would cause additional harm. The court appointed a special advocate who eventually agreed. Thus began my life with the Sisters of Mercy. I lived in a small room in the convent, nothing like my stone chamber, but still modest and plain. Sister Agnes became my primary caretaker. a surrogate mother who approached my recovery with patience and understanding. The nuns taught me to read and write, filling in the educational gaps from my years of imprisonment. A child psychologist visited 3 times a week, helping me process my trauma through art and play therapy. The physical recovery came faster than the emotional. Within 6 months, my body had begun to heal from the years of deprivation. My weight normalized, my muscles strengthened, my skin, once pallid from lack of sunlight, regained some color. But nightmares plagued my sleep. Sudden noises would send me into a dissociative state. The sound of church bells or religious music could trigger flashbacks so vivid, I believed I was back in the tunnels. As my 10th birthday approached, Sister Agnes shared news that would change the course of my recovery. Father Michael had been found dead in an abandoned hunting cabin 70 miles from Millfield. The cause was self-inflicted. He had left behind journals documenting his descent into religious mania, his belief that my family had been divinely selected to be purified, underground until the rapture, his conviction that he was doing God's work, even as he tortured and killed innocent people. The journals also revealed that my father had died within the first year of our captivity, after multiple escape attempts had led Father Michael to believe he was possessed by demons. This news should have brought closure. Instead, it ignited something new within me. Rage, pure, unfiltered rage that burned through the fog of trauma and fear that had enveloped me for so long. Father Michael had escaped earthly justice through death, had denied my family and me the satisfaction of seeing him answer for his crimes, had taken the coward's way out rather than face the consequences of his actions. More than that, I was angry that he had died believing until the end that he was righteous, that his twisted faith had never wavered, even as he destroyed an entire family. My therapy sessions changed after this revelation. My art became darker, my play scenarios more violent. My therapist, Dr. Linden, recognized this rage as a necessary part of my healing process. She encouraged me to channel it in productive ways, to write letters to my lost family members, to create art that expressed my anger, to engage in physical activities that released the tension building inside me. Sister Agnes, while supportive of my therapeutic journey, worried about the darkness growing within me. She encouraged me to find forgiveness, not for Father Michael's sake, but for my own. She spoke of the poison of vengeance, how it could corrupt the soul as surely as Father Michael's madness had corrupted his. I listened to her words but could not embrace them. Forgiveness felt like another betrayal of my family, another way that Father Michael would escape the consequences of his actions. As I entered my teenage years, my rage found new targets. Mr. Peterson, whose cowardice had enabled years of torture before his conscience finally compelled him to speak. The church officials who had failed to recognize Father Michael's deteriorating mental state before it was too late. The community that had noticed my family's disappearance but accepted too easily the story that we had moved away suddenly. The God that had allowed it all to happen. Sister Agnes arranged for me to meet with Mr. Peterson, now in hospice care and days away from death. She believed this confrontation might help me process my anger, might help me see the frail, dying man rather than the monster of my memories. I stood by his bedside, looking down at the withered figure, barely recognizable as the sacristan who had brought me water and emptied my waste bucket for years. His eyes filled with tears as he begged for my forgiveness, told me how the guilt had eaten away at him until he could no longer remain silent, how he prayed daily for my family and for me. I told him I was glad he was dying, that I hoped he would suffer in the afterlife as my family had suffered in this one, that his tears meant nothing compared to the ocean of grief I carried. Sister Agnes was shocked by my cruelty. Mr. Peterson simply nodded and said he deserved nothing less than my hatred, that he would accept whatever punishment awaited him beyond this life. He died 3 days later, his confession complete, but his absolution denied. Rather than bringing me peace, this encounter only deepened my resolve. Mr. Peterson had faced a reckoning of sorts before his death. Father Michael had escaped through suicide. But what of the others? The system that had failed us, the community that had forgotten us, the church that had harbored a madman. Would they ever acknowledge their role in our tragedy? Would they ever face consequences for their failures? On the 10th anniversary of our rescue, the diocese announced plans to raise St. Augustine Chapel and build a modern church in its place. The old colonial structure had been deemed structurally unsound. The tunnels beneath it, a liability that could not be mitigated. A memorial plaque would be installed honoring my family. A scholarship fund established in their name. The bishop spoke of healing and moving forward, of honoring the past while embracing the future. I watched the press conference on television, seated in the convent living room with Sister Agnes beside me. I was 15 now, old enough to understand the politics behind this decision. The church wanted to literally bury the evidence of their greatest failure, to pave over the site of unimaginable suffering with something new and unblemished. To control the narrative of what had happened beneath St. Augustine. Something shifted inside me that day. The unfocused rage that had sustained me for years crystallized into purpose. The vague desire for justice transformed into a concrete plan for vengeance. Not against Father Michael, already beyond my reach. Not against Mr. Peterson, whose punishment had come through his own conscience. But against the institution that had enabled them. Against the system that had failed to protect my family, against those who sought to minimize and eventually erase what had happened to us. That night, alone in my room at the convent, I made a decision. I would not allow the past to be buried with the old chapel. I would not accept plaques and scholarships as substitutes for accountability. I would find a way to ensure that the truth about the chosen ones was known. That the full extent of what had been done to my family was exposed, that those who had looked away would be forced to see. Sister Agnes found me the next morning, unusually calm after years of emotional turbulence. She attributed the change to acceptance, to the beginning of healing. She did not recognize it for what it truly was, the quiet that comes with absolute clarity of purpose. The peace that follows an irrevocable decision, the stillness before action. My time of grief and anger was over. My time of planning had begun. I approached my revenge methodically, with the patience born from years of captivity. The first step was information gathering. I needed to understand exactly who had known what and when about Father Michael's deteriorating mental state, who had been in positions of authority that could have intervened, who had chosen to look away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The convent library became my research center, newspaper archives my textbooks. Sister Agnes mistook my newfound interest in the church hierarchy and local history for a desire to better understand my past. She encouraged this scholarly pursuit, believing it was part of my healing process. She arranged for me to have access to the diocesan archives on supervised visits, ostensibly for a school project on the history of St. Augustine Chapel. Each visit yielded valuable information about the power structures that had protected Father Michael. I discovered that complaints about Father Michael's increasingly extreme sermons had been filed with the diocese as early as 2000 and on 2 years before my family's imprisonment. The bishop at the time, Bishop Reynolds, had dismissed these concerns as differences in theological interpretation, had praised Father Michael's dedication and passion, had allowed him to continue in his position without supervision or psychological evaluation. The current bishop, Bishop Carver, had been the vicar general when my family disappeared. He had personally approved the story that we had moved away suddenly due to a family emergency, had signed off on the transfer of our house deed to a distant cousin, a person I later confirmed had never existed, had facilitated the quick sale of our property and the dispersal of funds to various church renovation projects, including improvements to the very tunnels where we would be imprisoned. The parish council, of which my father had been a member, had raised questions about Father Michael's behavior in the months leading up to our disappearance. The meeting minutes recorded their concerns about his fixation on end-times theology, his growing isolation, his references to chosen families being preserved from worldly corruption. These concerns were documented, discussed, and ultimately ignored by church leadership who valued Father Michael's fundraising abilities over the warning signs of mental instability. Most damning of all, I found correspondence between Bishop Reynolds and a Catholic psychiatric facility specializing in clergy mental health issues. The bishop had consulted them about Father Michael's behavior without actually requiring Father Michael to undergo evaluation. The psychiatric professionals had strongly recommended immediate assessment based on the behaviors described. The bishop had thanked them for their input and taken no further action. Each piece of evidence I uncovered fueled my determination. This was not simply the story of one mad priest and his complicit sacristan. This was institutional failure at every level. People in positions of power had prioritized the church's reputation and financial interests over the safety of parishioners, had enabled Father Michael's madness through their inaction, had been accessories to the destruction of my family. While conducting this research, I cultivated a persona of recovery and healing. I excelled in my studies at the Catholic school. I now participated in community service projects organized by the convent, attended therapy sessions where I gradually presented the image of a young woman coming to terms with her traumatic past. Dr. Linden noted my progress in her reports, though she sometimes expressed concern about my emotional detachment when discussing my family. By my 16th birthday, I had identified the primary targets of my revenge: Bishop Reynolds, now retired but still influential in church circles; Bishop Carver, whose rapid rise through church hierarchy had been built partly on his handling of the scandal of my family's discovery; the 5 surviving parish council members who had noticed Father Michael's deterioration but failed to take meaningful action; the church attorneys who had structured the financial cover-up following our disappearance; the architectural firm now contracted to demolish St. Augustine and build its replacement. The next phase of my plan required resources. As the sole survivor of my family, I was entitled to our estate once I reached legal adulthood. However, much of our assets had been liquidated and dispersed by the church in the years following our disappearance. I needed legal help to recover what was rightfully mine. Sister Agnes, still believing in my healing journey, helped me connect with a lawyer specializing in victim advocacy. Ms. Renata Davis took my case pro bono, outraged by what had been done to my family. She filed motions to freeze any remaining assets from my family's estate, initiated proceedings to investigate the fraudulent transfer of our property, demanded an accounting of all funds generated from the sale of our possessions. The church, eager to avoid additional negative publicity, quickly offered a settlement that included a substantial financial package and an agreement to delay the demolition of St. Augustine until I turned 18 and could participate in the memorial planning. I accepted the settlement with a public statement of gratitude and forgiveness that was reported widely in local media. Behind the scenes, I used the financial resources to secure my independence. I opened accounts that would become accessible. Upon my 18th birthday, researched educational opportunities that would take me away from the convent while maintaining the appearance of a grateful, healing survivor. Established connections with journalists who had covered my family's story, positioning myself as someone who had found peace through faith and the support of the church. The delay in the chapel's demolition was crucial to my plans. The tunnels beneath St. Augustine contained physical evidence of the church's negligence and complicity, evidence that would disappear forever once the structure was razed and replaced. I needed access to those tunnels one final time, needed to document what remained of our prison before it was destroyed, needed to gather proof that could not be explained away or minimized by church officials. My opportunity came during the planning for the memorial service. As part of the healing process, Dr. Linden suggested that I might want to visit the tunnels one last time before the demolition, to confront the site of my trauma and reclaim my power from it. The church officials were reluctant, but eventually agreed under pressure from both my therapist and my lawyer. A supervised visit was arranged for the week before my 18th birthday. In preparation for this visit, I cultivated a relationship with Jenna Martinez, an investigative journalist who had written thoughtfully about my family's case over the years. Unlike other reporters who had sensationalized our story, Jenna had focused on the systemic failures that had allowed the tragedy to occur. I shared some of my research with her, building trust gradually. I told her I planned to make a full statement after my 18th birthday and the memorial service, that I would provide evidence of church negligence that had never before been made public. Sister Agnes noticed my increasing independence with a mixture of pride and concern. She questioned me about my plans after graduation, about my frequent meetings with Ms. Davis and occasional conversations with Jenna Martinez. I assured her that I was simply preparing for adulthood, that I wanted to honor my family's memory by becoming a voice for other victims of institutional abuse, that I had found purpose in ensuring such tragedies never happened again. All of this was true, though not in the way Sister Agnes understood. The final element of my revenge plan came into focus during a church fundraising gala 6 months before my 18th birthday. I attended as a special guest, the miracle survivor whose presence reminded donors of the church's commitment to healing and reconciliation. Bishop Carver introduced me to the assembled crowd, his hand heavy on my shoulder as he spoke of redemption and God's grace. I smiled and thanked him publicly for the church's support. Privately, I recorded our conversation afterward, in which he instructed me on what to say at the upcoming memorial service. I realized then that the memorial itself would be my greatest opportunity. All the principal players in my family's tragedy would be present. Media coverage would be extensive. The church expected me to provide the perfect ending to their redemption narrative, a survivor forgiving the institution that had failed her, a young woman moving forward with the church's blessing and support. They wanted to use me as the final chapter in a story they had carefully crafted to minimize their culpability. Instead, I would use the memorial to launch my revenge, to publicly present the evidence I had gathered of the church's knowledge and inaction, to expose the financial dealings that had followed my family's disappearance, to ensure that those responsible faced the consequences of their decisions in the court of public opinion, if not in a court of law. The memorial, meant to bury the past, would instead exhume it in all its horror. In the weeks leading up to my 18th birthday, I finalized my preparations. I secured an apartment in a neighboring city, leased to begin the day after the memorial. Arranged for admission to a university 3 states away, where I could study psychology and criminal justice. Transferred my settlement funds to accounts only I could access. prepared digital and physical copies of all evidence I had gathered to be released to multiple media outlets simultaneously. Most importantly, I arranged for my supervised visit to the tunnels beneath St. Augustine. Sister Agnes would accompany me, along with Dr. Linden and a church representative. The visit was scheduled for 3 days before the memorial service. Enough time for me to gather final evidence, but not so close to the event that any emotional reaction would prevent my attendance. The night before the tunnel visit, I had dinner with Sister Agnes in the convent dining room. The other nuns gave us privacy, sensing the significance of the moment. Sister Agnes spoke of how proud she was of my progress, of how my strength inspired everyone around me. She expressed hope that the tunnel visit would bring me closure before I embarked on my adult life. I reached across the table and took her weathered hand in mine. I told her that she had been the mother I needed after losing my own, that her kindness had saved me in ways she would never fully understand. Every word was true. Sister Agnes was the one person in this story who deserved no vengeance. I asked her if she believed that those who harm children would face divine justice even if they escaped earthly consequences. Her eyes searched mine for the motivation behind my question. She told me that God sees all sins, but that His mercy was available to those who truly repented. I asked if she thought Bishop Reynolds and Bishop Carver had repented for their role in enabling Father Michael. Her silence was answer enough. That night I packed a small bag with items I would need for the tunnel visit. A high-resolution camera disguised as an older model permitted by the church representative, a digital voice recorder, a small measuring tape, a notebook and pen. Tools of documentation rather than destruction. My revenge would not come through violence but through truth, the most devastating weapon against those who had built careers on lies. The revenge. The morning of my tunnel visit dawned clear and cold, much like that Christmas night 15 years earlier. I dressed carefully in layers, knowing the tunnels would be as damp and chilly as I remembered. Sister Agnes waited for me in the convent foyer, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. Dr. Linden arrived promptly at 9, followed by Mr. Walsh, the church representative assigned to supervise our visit. We drove to St. Augustine in silence, each lost in private thoughts. The chapel looked smaller than I remembered. Construction equipment surrounded the perimeter, ready to begin demolition once the memorial service concluded. A temporary fence encircled the property, keeping out curious onlookers and media. Mr. Walsh used his keycard to grant us access through the main gate. He explained that the tunnel entrance behind the altar had been unsealed specifically for today's visit, that church engineers had inspected the structure and declared it safe for our brief tour, that we would be limited to 30 minutes below ground due to air quality concerns. Sister Agnes took my hand as we entered the chapel. The familiar smell of incense and candle wax brought an immediate physical response. My heart raced. My palms sweat, my breathing quickened. Dr. Linden noticed these signs of distress and asked if I wanted to reconsider. I shook my head and continued forward. The altar had been partially dismantled in preparation for salvaging the marble for the new church. Behind it, the small wooden door that had been the beginning of our family's nightmare stood open. Mr. Walsh went first, carrying a modern electric lantern that cast harsh white light on the stone steps. Sister Agnes followed, then me with Dr. Linden bringing up the rear. The staircase spiraled down just as I remembered, though it seemed shorter through adult eyes. The air grew colder with each step. The sounds from above faded, until all I could hear was our footsteps and breathing. At the bottom, we entered the small antechamber with 3 tunnel entrances. I stopped, momentarily overwhelmed by the familiarity of the space. This was where my father had been struck down, where my mother had fought to protect us, where our family had been separated for the final time. Mr. Walsh consulted a diagram on his tablet, explaining that the tunnels had been mapped and marked according to their historical purpose. He pointed to each entrance: storage, escape route, living quarters during wartime. He made no mention of their more recent use as prison cells. I asked which tunnel had held my chamber. Mr. Walsh looked uncomfortable, but checked his notes. The rightmost tunnel, he said. That area had been designated Chamber C in the police reports. I moved toward it without waiting for permission. The tunnel was exactly as I remembered. Narrow stone walls, slick with moisture, low ceiling that now required me to duck slightly, the musty smell of earth and decay. My chamber was the third door on the left. The heavy wooden door hung partially, off its hinges, damaged during the police rescue 15 years earlier. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The small space was empty now, my metal bed and waste bucket long removed as evidence. But the walls still bore the marks of my captivity, scratches where I had tried to count days, small handprints in areas where the moisture had allowed the stone to soften slightly. A crude cross etched near the floor where I had knelt for enforced prayers. I took out my camera and began documenting these details, explaining to the others that I wanted personal records before the place was destroyed. Mr. Walsh shifted uncomfortably, but did not object. Dr. Linden commented on my composure, noting that confronting the site of trauma often provided unexpected strength. Sister Agnes remained silent, her eyes taking in the small chamber that had been my world for 5 years. I asked to see the other chambers. Mr. Walsh hesitated, consulting his tablet again. He reminded me that our time was limited, that the air quality deteriorated the longer we remained underground. I insisted. This was my only opportunity to see the places where my family had spent their final days. After a brief call to his superiors, he reluctantly agreed. We moved to the left tunnel first, where my mother and Sarah had been held. Each chamber told its own story of suffering. My mother's cell contained faded bloodstains on the floor that had never been completely cleaned, evidence of her final illness. Sarah's chamber revealed a small opening in the wall, the connection she'd used to visit me during our last weeks together. This detail had never been included in the official reports. I photographed it carefully, measuring its dimensions and noting its location relative to other features of the tunnels. The central tunnel housed what Father Michael had called the sanctuary. The large chamber with its crude altar remained largely intact. Religious artifacts littered the floor, candle stubs, torn pages from a Bible, a broken chalice. The space where we had knelt for Holy Communion while forbidden to speak or touch. I documented everything, asking occasional questions about structural elements that forced Mr. Walsh to consult his engineering reports, revealing information about the construction and modifications of the tunnels. We had not yet visited the chambers where my father and Thomas had been held. Mr. Walsh announced that our time was nearly up, that we needed to begin making our way back to the surface. I asked about the unvisited chambers. He explained that those areas had been deemed structurally unsound, that they were blocked off for safety reasons. I pressed the issue, reminding him that this was my only chance to see these spaces. Dr. Linden supported my request, arguing that complete exposure was therapeutic. After another call to his superiors, Mr. Walsh led us to a portion of the rightmost tunnel that had been roped off with caution tape. He warned us to proceed carefully, to touch nothing, to remain only a few minutes. Beyond the tape, the tunnel showed signs of collapse. Portions of the ceiling had crumbled, leaving debris on the floor. The air was noticeably thinner, dustier. The chamber that had held my father was partially filled with rubble. The door had been removed, but the hinges remained rusted and bent. I stepped carefully into the space, my camera documenting every detail. In the beam of Mr. Walsh's lantern, something metallic gleamed among the fallen stones. I moved closer, brushing aside dust to reveal a pair of eyeglasses. my father's glasses, lost during his final confrontation with Father Michael. Never included in the evidence collected by police, never mentioned in the official reports. I photographed them in situ, then carefully placed them in my pocket when the others were momentarily distracted. The final chamber, where Thomas had been held, was largely intact but showed signs of a violent struggle. Deep gouges marked the wooden door. The lock had been broken from the inside, not the outside, as would have happened during a rescue. Blood stained the threshold, long dried to a rusty brown. I took extensive photographs, noting the inconsistencies between what I was seeing and what had been reported in the official investigation. Mr. Walsh became increasingly agitated as our 30 minutes stretched to 45. He insisted we return to the surface immediately. The air quality was deteriorating rapidly. Our safety could no longer be guaranteed. I took a final moment in the antechamber, where our ordeal had begun, photographing the space from multiple angles and making notes about the structural modifications that had clearly been made to accommodate Father Michael's twisted purpose. As we climbed the spiral staircase toward daylight, I felt a strange sense of power. I had faced my prison as an adult rather than a child, had documented evidence that the church had sought to conceal, had reclaimed pieces of my family's story that others had tried to bury. The foundations of my revenge were now solid, built on truth rather than merely memory or emotion. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. I met with Jenna Martinez at a coffee shop 2 towns over, providing her with copies of the tunnel photographs and my research into the church hierarchy's knowledge of Father Michael's mental state. I gave her a sealed envelope containing my father's glasses and documentation of where they had been found, with instructions to open it only after the memorial service. I arranged for similar packages to be delivered to 3 other journalists, known for their uncompromising coverage of institutional abuse. The day before the memorial, I visited Mr. Peterson's grave in the small cemetery behind St. Augustine. His simple headstone bore only his name and dates, no mention of his decades of service to the church. I placed no flowers on his grave, offered no prayers for his soul. I simply stood there for a moment, acknowledging his role in both our imprisonment and our eventual discovery. His confession had saved my life, but came years too late to save my family. In the moral accounting of my story, he remained neither fully villain nor hero. The morning of the memorial dawned overcast, the sky heavy with approaching rain, symbolic weather for an event meant to wash away the sins of the past. I dressed carefully in a modest navy blue dress that Sister Agnes had helped me select. Conservative enough to please church officials, but adult enough to mark my transition from victim to survivor. My hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized my resemblance to my mother, a detail that would not be lost on those who had known my family. The service was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. By noon, media vans had begun to arrive, setting up equipment at the permitted distance from the chapel grounds. Security personnel checked credentials and maintained the perimeter. Inside St. Augustine, church volunteers arranged flowers and programs, set up photographs of my family on easels near the altar, prepared the refreshments that would be served. At the reception following the service, Bishop Carver arrived early to review the proceedings with the current parish priest. Both men greeted me with solemn handshakes and appropriate expressions of pastoral concern. The bishop reminded me of my speaking role in the service. 5 minutes of remarks following his address. An opportunity to bring closure to this chapter of church history, to demonstrate the healing power of faith and forgiveness. I nodded my understanding, clutching the folded paper containing my prepared remarks. By 1:30, the chapel was filled to capacity. Surviving parish council members occupied the front pews. Current church officials and diocesan representatives filled several rows. Media with special permission sat in a designated section. Community members who had known my family or simply followed our story over the years occupied the remaining seats. Sister Agnes sat directly behind me, her presence a steady comfort amid the spectacle. Bishop Reynolds, now 82 and frail, was wheeled in by an aide just before the service began. He nodded to Bishop Carver and took his place of honor near the altar. The two men who had enabled Father Michael's madness through their inaction, now united in a ceremony meant to absolve them of responsibility. The sight of them together, respected and revered despite their failures, strengthened my resolve. The service began with hymns and prayers. The parish priest welcomed the assembled crowd and spoke of remembrance and healing. A church historian gave a sanitized account of St. Augustine Chapel's significance to the community, making only brief mention of the tragedy that had occurred beneath its foundations. Bishop Carver approached the podium to deliver the main address, his voice resonant with practiced emotion. He spoke of the incomprehensible actions of one troubled priest, of the shock and sorrow that had engulfed the diocese upon discovering what had happened to my family, of the Church's commitment to ensuring such events never occurred again. He praised my courage and resilience, my faith that had survived unimaginable trauma, my forgiveness that allowed the community to heal and move forward. Not once did he mention the warnings that had been ignored, the complaints that had been dismissed, the financial transactions that had followed our disappearance. When he finished, Bishop Carver invited me to speak. The chapel fell silent as I made my way to the podium. Cameras focused on my face. Reporters leaned forward in anticipation of the expected message of reconciliation. I unfolded my prepared remarks and set them aside. I had memorized a different speech, the words I had been crafting for years, rather than the platitudes the Church expected. I began by thanking Sister Agnes and the Sisters of Mercy for their genuine care during my recovery, for showing me what true Christian compassion looked like in contrast to what I had experienced. This sincerity established my credibility with the audience, demonstrated that I was not speaking from blind hatred of all religious figures. Only then did I turn my attention to the institutional failures that had enabled our tragedy. I spoke clearly and without emotion about the documented warnings regarding Father Michael's mental state that had been ignored by church leadership, about Bishop Reynolds' decision not to require psychiatric evaluation despite professional recommendations, about Bishop Carver's role in creating the false narrative of our family's sudden relocation, about the parish council members who had noticed concerning behavior but taken no meaningful action. The chapel remained deathly silent as I methodically presented fact after fact, dates, document numbers, financial transactions, names of officials who had participated in decisions that ultimately enabled Father Michael's crimes. I described the physical evidence I had documented in the tunnels that contradicted official reports, the modifications that could only have been made with diocesan approval and funding, the bloodstains and signs of violence that had never been fully investigated. Bishop Carver rose from his seat, moving toward the podium in an attempt to interrupt. I continued speaking, my voice growing stronger rather than weaker. I revealed that copies of all evidence had been provided to multiple media outlets, that full documentation would be made public following this service, that my remarks today were not the end of this story, but the beginning of a full accounting that the Church had tried to prevent. Security personnel approached the podium at Bishop Carver's signal. I had anticipated this response. I concluded my remarks by addressing the assembled media directly. I directed them to a website that had gone live at the beginning of the service, a digital archive of all evidence I had gathered, testimonies from former church employees who had witnessed concerning behavior and reported it without result, financial records showing the dispersal of my family's assets, the complete truth that the memorial service had been designed to obscure. As I was escorted from the podium, cameras flashed. Reporters rushed from the chapel to file breaking stories. Community members murmured in shock at revelations that contradicted the narrative they had been given for years. Bishop Reynolds was quickly wheeled out a side door by his aide. Bishop Carver attempted to regain control of the service, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of public exposure. I was taken to a small office behind the chapel to be admonished for deviating from approved remarks, for turning a healing service into a public accusation, for damaging the church's reputation with unsubstantiated claims. I listened calmly to these reprimands, then informed church officials that my lawyer was waiting outside, that any attempt to discredit or silence me would result in immediate legal action, that the time for institutional protection at the expense of truth had ended. By evening, my revelations dominated local news. By the following morning, national outlets had picked up the story. The website containing my evidence crashed repeatedly from the volume of traffic. Jenna Martinez published a front-page exposé featuring photographs of my father's glasses found in a location that should have been thoroughly searched years earlier. The diocese issued a statement promising a full investigation of the claims, a transparent review of past actions, and appropriate consequences for any verified misconduct. Bishop Carver submitted his resignation within 48 hours, citing health concerns rather than acknowledging the true reason. Bishop Reynolds issued a statement through his family claiming age-related cognitive decline prevented him from responding to accusations about events from decades past. The parish council members named in my documentation variously denied knowledge, claimed misunderstanding, or remained silent in the face of mounting evidence of complicity. The demolition of St. Augustine Chapel was postponed indefinitely pending investigations by both church authorities and local law enforcement. The tunnel network was designated a crime scene and thoroughly documented by forensic teams. Additional evidence emerged supporting my claims about institutional knowledge and inaction. Former church employees, emboldened by my public stand, came forward with their own testimonies of warnings ignored and concerns dismissed. I left Millfield the day after the memorial service as planned, moved into my apartment in the neighboring city, prepared for university in the fall, declined most interview requests, but worked closely with investigative journalists pursuing the full scope of institutional failure. My revenge was not the dramatic destruction of individuals, but the systematic exposure of truth, the dismantling of carefully constructed narratives, the demand for accountability from those who had believed themselves beyond reach. In the months that followed, the consequences of my actions rippled through church hierarchy. The diocese underwent restructuring. New policies for reporting and addressing clergy mental health concerns were implemented. Financial oversight was strengthened to prevent misuse of assets. The survivors of abuse within other institutions found courage in my example, coming forward with their own stories of systemic failure and cover-up. My personal vengeance became a catalyst for broader change. The chosen ones had finally been heard, not as Father Michael intended, as silent vessels of his madness, not as the Church intended, as a tragic footnote in institutional history, but as my family deserved to be heard, as individuals whose lives and deaths mattered, whose story exposed the dangers of unchecked power and unquestioned authority, whose legacy would now include not only their suffering, but the reforms their story inspired. 5 years have passed since the memorial service that became a reckoning. I'm 23 now, completing my master's degree in psychology with a focus on institutional trauma and recovery. The quiet life I lead bears little resemblance to the media frenzy that followed my revelations. Most people I encounter daily have no idea of my history or my role in exposing one of the most significant church scandals of the decade. St. Augustine Chapel was eventually demolished, but not before complete documentation of the tunnel network and comprehensive forensic examination of all evidence. The new church built on the site bears no resemblance to the colonial structure it replaced. A memorial garden occupies the ground above where the tunnels once ran. 5 stone benches arranged in a circle, one for each member of my family. No plaque explains their significance. No text attempts to contain our story in sanitized language. Those who know, know. Those who do not are spared the burden of our history. Bishop Carver was later implicated in covering up similar abuse in other parishes. His resignation expanded into full removal from clerical duties following an internal church investigation. Bishop Reynolds died before facing any formal consequences, but his legacy was permanently altered by the exposure of his failure to act on clear warning signs of Father Michael's deteriorating mental state. Both men lost the respect and authority they had valued above the safety of those in their care. The diocese established a substantial victims fund following multiple lawsuits inspired by my public stand. The money means little to me. My purpose was never financial compensation, but accountability. Still, I recognize that for many survivors of institutional abuse, such funds represent both practical support for recovery and symbolic acknowledgement of harm. My own settlement remains largely untouched in accounts that will eventually fund research and advocacy. Sister Agnes continues her work at the convent, though her health has begun to decline in recent years. We speak weekly by phone. She visits me during university breaks. Our relationship survived the shock of my public revelations, though she admitted feeling initially betrayed by my secrecy. Over time, she came to understand that my actions were necessary, that true healing required truth rather than the comfortable fictions the church had constructed, that my revenge through exposure had accomplished more meaningful change than forgiveness without accountability ever could. I have not returned to Millfield since leaving 5 years ago. The small rural community where everyone knew everyone became divided in the aftermath of my revelations. Some residents resented the negative attention brought to their town. Others expressed shame at their own passive acceptance of the church's explanations for my family's disappearance. The fractures within the community reflect larger divisions about institutional authority and individual responsibility that my story brought to the surface. The physical evidence I gathered during my supervised visit to the tunnels became the foundation for a comprehensive review of the original investigation. Several officers involved in the initial case faced disciplinary action for investigative failures. The forensic re-examination of the tunnels revealed additional evidence supporting my claims about the circumstances of my father's and brother's deaths. Their official causes of death were revised to reflect the violence they had suffered rather than the sanitized versions initially recorded. My father's glasses, recovered from the rubble of his chamber, were eventually returned to me after serving their purpose as evidence. They sit on my desk now, a tangible connection to the man who tried desperately to save his family, who fought against madness with courage that went unrecognized for too long, whose final moments remained unwitnessed but not uninvestigated. Not anymore. The journalists who helped amplify my evidence have remained allies in the years since. Jenna Martinez won a prestigious award for her continued investigation into institutional failures that enabled abuse. Her work expanded beyond my family's case to expose similar patterns in other organizations. We meet occasionally for coffee when her reporting brings her to my city. Compare notes on the slow progress of institutional reform. Acknowledge the work still to be done. I have found unexpected peace in the aftermath of my revenge. Not the peace of forgiveness that Sister Agnes hoped I would find, but the peace of purpose fulfilled, of truth spoken regardless of consequence, of justice achieved not through violence, but through unwavering commitment to accountability. As a she. Rage that fueled my teenage years has transformed into determined advocacy. The trauma that shaped my childhood has become the foundation for helping others navigate similar journeys. Dreams of my family still come, not the nightmares that plagued me for years, but quieter visitations. My mother singing lullabies that echo through tunnel walls. My father's strong hands guiding me up toward light. Thomas standing guard between danger and his younger siblings. Sarah finding paths through stone walls when no escape seemed possible. These dreams bring comfort rather than terror. Remind me that I carry not only the trauma of our story, but also the love that existed before and during our imprisonment. The tunnel network beneath St. Augustine has been permanently sealed, filled with concrete to ensure no future exploration. The physical space of our captivity no longer exists except in documentation and memory. This brings a certain symmetry to our story. The darkness that contained us has been contained in turn, the underground prison permanently closed, the secrets fully exposed to light before being laid to rest. I sometimes wonder what Father Michael would think of the consequences of his actions, of how his attempt to preserve the chosen ones in underground isolation instead exposed decades of institutional failure to the scrutiny of the world, of how his madness, enabled by those who should have intervened, ultimately led to reforms that might prevent similar tragedies. There is irony there, though I take no pleasure in it, only acknowledgement of how actions ripple outward in unexpected directions. People occasionally ask if I regret my public revelations, if the upheaval that followed was worth the personal cost, if exposure was truly better than accepting the Church's offers of private resolution and generous settlement. I tell them that truth is not negotiable, that institutional protection at the expense of individual justice is what allowed our tragedy to occur in the first place, that my family deserved a full accounting of what happened to them and why, that silence serves only those with power, never those who have been harmed by its misuse. I'm not the person I might have been had my family attended a different church. That Christmas night, had we driven home through the snow rather than remaining behind at Father Michael's request? Had Bishop Reynolds required psychiatric evaluation when concerns were first raised? Had Mr. Peterson found his courage years earlier? The person I might have been is as lost to me as my family. In her place stands someone forged by darkness, but determined to create light. Someone who knows that the most effective revenge against systems of silence is simply to speak. The chosen ones were not chosen for divine purpose as Father Michael believed. We were chosen by circumstance, by vulnerability, by the failures of those meant to protect. My family did not survive to tell their story, but I survived to tell it for them, to ensure that their suffering was not buried beneath concrete and convenient narratives, to transform personal vengeance into public accountability, to honor them not through forgiveness of the unforgivable, but through unflinching commitment to truth. This is how I avenged my family's holy imprisonment. Not with violence, but with evidence. Not with hatred, but with unflinching documentation. Not with destruction, but with exposure. The most powerful weapon against institutions that thrive in shadows is simply bringing them into the light, making them see what they have chosen not to see, forcing them to hear voices they have chosen not to hear, ensuring that those who looked away must finally look directly at the consequences of their inaction. In the end, my revenge was not the destruction of those responsible, but the destruction of the systems that protected them. Not the punishment of individuals, but the transformation of institutions. Not closure, but opening files that had been sealed, questions that had been silenced, truths that had been buried as surely as my family beneath centuries of stone. The light now shines where darkness once ruled. That is revenge enough.